Hello, everyone. I'm not sure. Is my mic on? No, it is not. Well, so glad to be here in sunny Barcelona, although it's very cold in this specific room. Okay, we're ready. My name is Angie Malltezi, and I'll be talking about building effective systems. So, when I was younger, I had a problem with authority. More specifically, I didn't quite understand the way that the systems operated in our world. When I was in high school, towards about 2 years, towards my final year, about grade 11 and 12, I was in this very intensive program where essentially I would have to study for about a year, year and a half, and then I'd have to write these final exams. Which meant that I only had one chance to be able to do very well and sort of condense about a year and a half's material into one test. And so naturally, I tend to work very, very hard, and I tend to be a bit of an individualistic person. And so I found myself sort of skipping classes here and there so I could study because I felt like I was running out of time. Come towards the final year, grade 12, I write these exams. So it was about 2 months before I was due to graduate. I thought I did really well. I was like, yes, I'm finally so close to ending this sort of nightmare that had been high school for me. Well, about 6 weeks before graduation, I got called into the principal's office. They sat me down and she said, Angie, unfortunately, you've missed too many classes that you're not eligible to graduate. And so my heart sank. I felt like everything that I'd done for about 4 years, working so hard and skipping so many social activities, just so I could write these exams, do well, and move on to the next phase of my life. I didn't quite understand the system that I was a part of, which was primarily designed to reward physical bodies rather than to reward learning. And so it put me on a journey to understand systems. I started to explore biological systems, and more broadly, I was interested in organizations and what it actually means to design a company's well. So what is a system anyway? So this model over here is typically used in sociology. It essentially talks about a system from the micro level, so the individual in relationships, to the meso level, organizations. How do we actually design our communities? How do we design our companies so that they work effectively? And then more broadly, macro. The main takeaway of this system and why I like it so much is because it's interrelated, which means that if we impact one person or one aspect of the system, it'll sort of trickle down and have broader impacts in the broader world. For today's talk, I really want to focus on micro and meso systems, and we're going to first start off with the individual. I apologize, I feel like I'm getting feedback from the mic. All right, so this is what I think probably happens in our brain. This is my version of what happens in my brain. I view it that we have this control center. This control center is responsible for taking in stimulation from the outside world, and depending on who is in front of the controls, the control center will respond in the way that we react. And for me, I have this creature that I typically, think of in my mind as the ego monster. You can see that it has spikes on its head for defensive armor. Its arms are sort of up. I'll just project my voice. But essentially, this ego monster is responsible and very heightened. Is this better? Thumbs up? Okay, perfect. So this ego monster is responsible for getting really triggered or activated whenever there's moments of fear and stress. And typically I find that when my ego monster is behind the control center, the reaction and the decisions that I make often aren't really beneficial to me or to the relationships I'm having. And I find that typically this ego monster tends to show up a lot, more specifically when we're in a relationship with others. And what exactly triggers the ego monster? As I mentioned, for me, it's about fear, insecurity, and stress. But for many of us, it's oftentimes when we feel like we've lost our sense of control, when we feel, for instance, that somebody's judging us. Actually, one of the reasons that public speaking is so anxiety-inducing is because we feel like we're going to be judged and sort of pushed away by others in our society and our friends. And so typically moments like this is likely when the ego monster would be up or ready to defend if there's a slight sense of disapproval. But there's also a lot of other stuff that sort of gets in the way. And hopefully now you kind of sense that I view the world in like images and pictures. And oftentimes when two people are in conversation with one another, I view this sort of window of distortion that I call it in my mind. And depending on what's going on in our internal ecosystem, the window of distortion will either be more blurry or just more sort of contaminated, and the information going out and the information being received is not exactly 100%. It's sort of at a 50% confidence level, if you know, on a good day. And obviously this can lead to a lot of issues in relationships. So then how do we actually acknowledge that these are things that happen to us as people, and that way we can better design our workplace systems or broader of our companies? So this slide and the slide after it, it's not really intended for you guys to read. I'll lightly talk over it. Some of the things that we found to work really well is to minimize the situations where people feel like they're lost control. So for instance, if there's a big team meeting, or if you're in a position, you're like a C-suite or you have a lot of responsibility, you might feel a lot of pressure when you go into a meeting to report to others. And so you can have pre-written agendas ahead of time. You can adopt a memo culture similar to Amazon. Or more effectively, if you're in a position of leadership, setting like OKRs very clearly and effectively and only revealing maybe a month or 2 months ahead of time to your team will help lower that anxiety that people typically feel when you're working with more individuals. And as I mentioned, the whole point of systems is that they're multivariable. So when we have two people, that mirror or window of confusion is very distorted. But when we introduce another person, then it starts to get really chaotic and messy. And this makes me think a lot about, how do we actually design our broader organizations? So something to know a bit about my background is that I spent quite a bit of time working with Fortune 500 company executives, primarily helping them restructure their capabilities as organizations to figure out how to actually capture new revenue or cannibalize parts of their businesses and start up whole new entities. And so you're dealing with people with numbers that like hundreds and thousands of people. And you need to figure out when you're in a position of leadership, how do you make sure that you're able to grow your business at scale with time? There is this concept that I want to talk a bit about. It's called a capability model. So this capability model really can be thought of as a blueprint for how a company delivers value. And what I mean by that is based off of the capabilities that a business has, it'll give you a sense of how it prioritizes information flow, how it prioritizes where it will invest in the future, and most importantly, the way that it'll provide for its customers. So a capability model, it's only one deliverable part of a broader operating model strategy. That's like a pretty complicated thing. However, I felt that this concept's really important to discuss with anybody that's building a business, because it'll help you better prepare, whether you're a team of about 10 to about a team of 100, thousands as you move forward. So some of the stuff that I want to really shout out about this particular capability model is that each of the boxes can be thought of as Lego pieces. And so for instance, here we see that this particular business has a really strong R&D capacity. They really value research and development, and then they sort of funnel their innovation and information into different product flow. The fact that there's 2 different products segmented into 2 different capability areas, to me indicates that there's a reason why they need completely different dev teams to be able to focus on those products so that they're not sharing resources, but also they're not sharing information. That could be a regulatory thing, or it could be that, for instance, the products are so diverse and complex that it's just going to cost too much communication overhead to be able to have teams work on the infrastructure. When you're building capability models, or even as you're thinking about a business, there's a lot of different things that you need to consider in terms of trade-offs as your business grows, depending on the stage of where you are. For instance, when you're in an early stage business, let's say about 10 people, the person making a lot of the decisions in charge is likely the founder or maybe the founding team. And so as the business grows a little bit to maybe about 20 to 50 to 100 people, you'll start to make some decisions around Do we want the decisions at the product level? Do we want specific functions to make decisions without me being in the room? And that's where we see that central versus decentralized decision making. This is quite common in sort of the traditional world, but it's really interesting to see sort of our industry adopt this as we experiment with literally running whole new entities and businesses in decentralized ways. And then when we think about formal versus informal, as the business grows, then that's the time where you think about formal processes. Does everybody use the same tech stack? Does everybody follow a memo culture? As I mentioned, every time we add a new person into a system, that variable of like chaos just exponentially increases. And so you'll find yourself trying to deal with the problem of how do I make sure that the decisions that I make don't take a year to go through the organization. And that is really where capability models come through. I find them to be very helpful no matter at what stage your organization is to design and think about, because it can help you plan for how you want to grow your business over time. So why don't we go through an example? Consider this company. We'll call it Company X. It's an on-chain analytics business. Basically, their mission is to essentially replicate Google Analytics, but for Web3. They had to pull in a bunch of data. They had to create their own data lake. And right now, they're a company of 10 people. You can see that there's only like 2 boxes for capabilities, which means that there's likely only 1 or 2 people doing all of the stuff in the business section. And then you have, 8 or 9 developers being responsible for everything from security to architecture to data acquisition to data cleansing, data integration, creating an analytics platform. And so you can start to see that it becomes this particular business isn't necessarily scalable the way that it is right now. And this company, they have 1 MVP product. They only serve a type of customer, which is just startups. So their dashboard and their capability, like what they actually present, isn't too complex. So now, if I am, for instance, was the CEO of this particular company, I would need to decide, where do I want to put my biggest investments in? Do I want to diversify my business by having whole new products? And what is that going to look like in terms of the kinds of capabilities that I choose to invest in? Or do I, let's say, want to double down in like the infrastructure that I built, and I prefer to go sell it to other businesses? So these are the kinds of decisions that you typically need to make as you be able to move forward from early stage to the next stage. So if we follow this Company X moving forward a little bit, we're able to see now that this company has grown to about 100 people, and they've decided instead to double down on creating product lines to serve 3 different customer groups: private, enterprise, and government clients. The important thing that I want to sort of state about these capability models is that they're not meant to be static. Like the way that we evolve and grow as humans is typically how businesses evolve and grow as well, which means what they look like at a 4-month, 6-month, 5 years is very different. And so part of being in a position of leadership is really to decide, how do I think about like the segments or sort of the Lego blocks of my business and make sure that it's modular enough so that I'm able to rebuild something else in a few years' time. And for them, for this particular company, we see that they decided that they're really going to create a formalized process for their data and technology infrastructure, which means that the majority of their capabilities to increase efficiency will likely be together. But if, let's say, they decided that they don't care that much about pace, they care more so about customization, then it's like that data and technology section would be sort of segmented and different, which means that they would have sort of duplicate engineers on both sides doing the same type of work, but slightly focused on different features. And so why does this matter, and why is this sort of important? Well, because if your business grows to the point where you're now dealing with different geographies, it gets a bit more complicated here. Now you need to make decisions around, do I want to literally copy and paste my business model and serve this particular geography in the way that it's structured right now with the same teams? Or is it just easier to just create a whole new thing because the regulatory landscape's a bit different? And it might not necessarily make sense for the customers that I intend to serve in this particular part of the world. These are typically the kinds of decisions that are really important, but I've found, to be frank, never really happen. There's like a book that I read a long time ago. It's called Mythical Man Month. I'm not sure if either of you have read it. I don't know, raise of hands. Great, I see some people as well. Basically, this book was written in 1975. It was written by a lead software engineer at IBM, and he wrote some principles for the way that he found to effectively create software development. Interestingly enough, I find that a lot of the principles that I read in that book are applicable to designing businesses and other avenues. So something that I'm a really big fan of is intentional design. So before I sort of move on to another product or whether I'm advising a business, I tend to think about really intentionally, what might this look like in a few years and why have I made this specific decision? And I find that if you just take the time to think about a particular problem before you sort of do it right away, which I feel like is the complete opposite of the narrative we're given in startup culture, which is move fast, which I find is sort of silly because if you just thought about it, let's say an hour, then you could have avoided a ton of rework later on. The main kind of point of this is that when you're building a business, it gets really difficult to go back and sort of cut people and capabilities and move and change people's ways of working. Humans, we're not AI, which means that it takes a lot of time and energy for us to rebuild trust and get sort of new investment into the things that we're doing, which means that if I was a business, executive for this particular company and I decided that I'm no longer going to serve those 3 product lines, instead I'm going to do something completely different, well then 90% of my business will be really difficult to change and to sort of move them forward, which means that I sort of have 2 options. I can go through the very painful process of growth, of sort of reorganization, which will likely take me about 2 to 5 years. People will leave, my executive team won't be happy, none of the employees will be happy as I sort of force them to relearn new things that I want them to, for them to fit into new capability buckets. Otherwise, if I thought a bit more about where I plan to invest, and it's easier for me to take up the Lego pieces that I designed already and decide, okay, I'm going to move these Lego pieces over here, they're going to serve this particular market, and these Lego pieces will eventually grow to do X, Y, Z. And so it makes it a bit easier to determine about people. The other kind of going back to that book, Mythical Man Month, one of the big principles that he would say quite often is that adding a new person to solve the same problem where the team is already working doesn't make us solving the problem faster. It typically introduces a lot of burden and barriers, so it doesn't shorten the timeline to deliver something. So I've talked a bit about capability models. I've talked a bit about the ego monster. One of the things that hopefully I'd like to leave you with is that about how I think about leadership. So for me, I really like to expand the definition of what it means to lead, to mean that any person that is able to influence in some sort of change. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be in a position of what our society calls power, a high sort of title, but rather I've always felt that the best leaders are people that are very adept at understanding realistically what is actually happening so that they can solve the problems well. And so part of that has to do with being able to recognize when is that ego monster in the room that has been leading and making decisions that are very different than the reality of what is actually happening in the situation. So I leave you with one of my favorite quotes, which is about really understanding and having empathy for ourselves as well as others, that we have a moral responsibility to other people and ourselves around the decisions that we make. Thank you.